the willingness to go along with the lie. That's precisely what sustains that harmful, oppressive regime.
In this episode, I sit down with Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, author of The New Abnormal and former director of the Medical Ethics Program at UCI Health. What is an unjust law, and how do you identify it? What is the difference between totalitarianism and dictatorship?
At the end point of that process, you don't even need concentration camps or secret police or mass surveillance anymore, because every citizen starts silencing their fellow citizens.
Kheriaty is one of the plaintiffs in the landmark Missouri versus Biden free speech case.
Even the Treasury Department was involved in censorship. The Census Bureau was involved in censorship.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, such a pleasure to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
It's always great to be with you, Jan.
Let's talk about something you told me a little bit earlier today. It really captured my imagination. You said the totalitarian systems of the 20th century, they always begin by monopolizing what counts as rationality and what counts as knowledge. So first of all, justify that to me, right?
Yeah.
And let's use it as a jumping point.
Yeah, so when people hear the word totalitarian, they often think of secret police, men in jackboots, and concentration camps or gulags or mass surveillance. And all those features are important, but the real starting point and the core of a totalitarian system is an ideology that monopolizes what counts as rationality and what counts as knowledge, what counts as a legitimate question to ask. So if you raise your hand and ask an inconvenient question, the Marxist ideologue or the Nazi ideologue or the fascist ideologue doesn't say, hey, Jan, let's sit down and debate this question. Or you present your evidence and I'll present mine and we'll try to learn from one another. They simply say, no, you're questioning the ideology because you're infected with bourgeois consciousness, or for the Nazi, you're just infected with Jew consciousness. You're protecting your own class-based interest, or you're protecting your own, interest to advance your aims, and therefore you're not worth talking to, right? You're not part of the enlightened elites that understand the direction of history, that understand where things need to go. And so I'm not going to debate you. I'm just going to exclude you from public conversation. That's where the concentration camps and the gulags and the secret police come in to enforce the ideology. One of the reasons I think now, today, in Western countries, which we don't tend to think of as totalitarian, one of the reasons that I'm very concerned about the direction that we're moving is because if you look at new phenomena, new trends like government-sponsored censorship, they mirror that starting point of totalitarian systems. They put forward a particular ideology or particular public policy proposal and say, citizens are not allowed to question this. Citizens are not allowed to present evidence that might call this public policy into question. And in fact, if they do so, we're going to label them as dangerous. We're going to algorithmically, let's say, on social media, exclude them from the realm of public conversation. We're going to limit their reach. We're going to limit the ability of other people to hear their ideas. This is where totalitarian systems always begin, and in fact, this is where totalitarian systems always end up. Once the ideology is sufficiently adopted by enough members of the population, once people get used to the idea that I'm not allowed to ask questions, and they just internalize those prohibitions. At the end point of that process, you don't even need concentration camps or secret police or mass surveillance anymore, because every citizen becomes a member of the Gestapo or the KGB. Every citizen starts silencing their fellow citizens if they raise any inconvenient questions that might challenge the ideology. This, according to Hannah Arendt, who studied the totalitarian systems of the 20th century, this becomes then the worst form of imprisonment, in a sense. And she draws a distinction between dictatorships that rule through external force, and they rule by means of instilling fear in the population. I'm not going to say the wrong thing because I don't want to get punished by the regime. I'm not going to challenge the dictatorial ruler and his ideas because he might then come down on me or do something to harm me or harm my family. A totalitarian regime uses external force initially to try to funnel people into the ideology, but eventually the totalitarian system no longer needs to use external force because people have internalized the ideology. In a dictatorship, you still at least have the interior freedom, even if your exterior freedom is constrained, you still have the interior freedom to think your own thoughts and to have your own opinions and to have your own judgments. You might voice them only very carefully, and you might not voice them at all, but you can still think them on your own. But in a totalitarian system, in a perfectly enacted totalitarian system, you don't even have that because the ideology has become so internalized that the questions no longer occur to you. The dissenting thoughts no longer occur to you. You're in a prison with invisible bars without even realizing that you're in prison. Your interior freedom has also been subsumed into that totalitarian system.
Well, so here's the thing, right? I think we both mutually have become aware of this kind of on parallel tracks, but people are not all the same. And there are some people that are, it apparently, as it happens, are incredibly suggestible.
Yeah.
Right? In fact, so suggestible that it seems like the social consensus, societal consensus is something, the next day they might change their mind if that is somehow projected. There's another group of people, though, that are somehow immune. And we know a lot of these people, just kind of wondering what the heck is going on, right? And shocked. And then there's kind of a middle group, and this mirrors something. I remember this Aldous Huxley interview from the 60s, where he talks about a quarter of the population being easy to, say, hypnotize, another quarter which is immune, and everybody else is kind of just depends on the situation, right? And I've seen this mirrored also in Lobachevsky's work, where he sort of in the opening, he's explaining how he saw the sort of the totalitarian system coming into the Jagiellonian University, where he was studying psychology, and watched a similar sort of dynamic, a similar sort of proportions, maybe not exactly. But I've been thinking about this a lot. So in this scenario that you're talking about, now getting to the point, there's always these people that are, let's call them freedom-oriented, and somehow just, or reality-oriented. I don't know, that might be saying too much, but freedom-oriented. Like, no, I'm not gonna accept this thing that I'm kind of supposed to believe. Even I would expect those people will continue to exist, and of course in these totalitarian states they're marginalized, right? Or killed, or whatever.
Right.
So account for if you agree with me, account for this. Yeah.
Yeah, I do. This does seem to be a recurrent phenomenon where, in my view, it's probably 30% of people highly hypnotizable, prone to mass formation, however you want to characterize that, who, for one reason or another, are going to go along with whatever the authorities are saying or whatever the general consensus appears to be. And they're going to have a diminished ability, let's say, or diminished interest in questioning that consensus. Probably a smaller proportion of the population, maybe 10, 15%, is going to make up the people who are less prone to feel like I have to affiliate with the group, I have to go along with the consensus, and who are capable of sort of standing against that tide or standing against that social pressure and really having independent ideas. It doesn't mean that all of their ideas are good. Their ideas may be wrong-headed as well, but at least temperamentally, however they're built by temperament or some combination of temperament and experience, they're not prone to move in that direction. And the rest of the folks in the middle, I'm not very good at math, whatever the remainder would be, I think can go one way or the other depending on their situation, depending on their interests. And just putting on my psychiatrist hat for a moment, this probably has something to do with innate temperamental traits that make some people have a stronger felt need for group affiliation, which all of us have. I mean, no human being can exist in perfect isolation. John Donne said, no man is an island sufficient unto himself. Solitary confinement is one of the worst punishments we can inflict on human beings because, human beings are social animals, and our bodies, our brains do not function well in isolation from other human beings. We're built to be in relationship. But I think the need for strong affiliation, you can have variation within the population. You can have some people that are able to feel like I can maintain my relationships, I can maintain my place in the social realm without having to agree with other people, without having to hold the same opinions, and I can stand against some degree of social pressure that others might find intolerable. When I look at that 10, 15%, whatever it is, of, let's call them dissidents in societies that move in authoritarian or totalitarian directions, it's hard for me to identify one particular personality type or one particular type of life experience. It's certainly hard, you can't identify them based on political affiliation. So, that group cuts across our typical left-right distinctions that we see, at least in American political life. So what is it that makes up that group of people that is different from the rest? I think it's a really interesting question, how the dissidents came to their dissenting opinions. And after talking to many of them over the last 3 years, some of them have experiences coming from a prior totalitarian regime, and they know what it was like to live under Soviet communism or live in one of the Eastern Bloc states, or they came from Cuba under Castro, and they say, I look around now and I can see many of the things that I was fleeing from. You can hear that from people coming to the United States from China, for example, these days. That there's a kind of convergence between the way in which ideologies are functioning in China, and the Chinese Communist Party is controlling the flow of information, controlling how people think, and trends that are now developing in Western nations, including the United States. So sometimes I think it's life experience with the way these things can go really, really bad and lead in seriously harmful directions for society. But I think other people come at this based on other life experiences and being forged in being willing to stand up to other kinds of challenges where they decided, no, I'm not going to go along with this thing. I'm not going to sort of compromise my integrity or pretend to believe something that I have serious doubts about. And I think we need to try to figure out, what makes those people tick so that we can cultivate more of that in our system of education, which we're clearly not doing now.
Another trend that I've noticed, and it's not by no means universal, but is people that have strong faith in many cases. I see a disproportionate amount of people that have strong faith that kind of aren't as impacted. And I wonder, so as we were talking here, I found myself wondering whether that might not help people who aren't, say, in the middle group, right? If we're accepting this sort of, division of people to have that be inoculated in some way.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons for that, I agree with you. Very often it's people of faith that are willing to stand against a regime and question it. Human life is extremely complicated, and no one individual human being is able to figure out everything in terms of how should I live and what's true and what's not true. We like to think of ourselves as hard-headed, empirically minded, testing ideas. But the fact is, most of what we hold to be true, we believe based on faith. And by faith, I don't mean necessarily faith in divine revelation, but faith in what other people have told us, right? So I have not actually gone to outer space and seen definitively that the world is round, but apparently some people have, and I have no reason to believe that they may be deceiving me about the fact that the Earth is round. And so I'm going to, and you go through any of the subjects that you learned in school, most of the science you learned in school, you didn't run those experiments yourself to confirm those findings. You're taking it, in a sense, on the authority of people who are supposed to be experts, are supposed to know this. And most of what we know, I think, operates in that fashion. And it has to, because we're social animals and we're not capable of wrapping our heads around all the complexities of life. I think people intuitively understand that, and people intuitively want there to be an authority that they can trust. Again, especially we Americans, we tend to think of ourselves as sort of anti-authoritarian and willing to be independent-minded and challenge consensus. But even rugged American individualists still want a news source or a source of information that they can trust. Still want to believe that public officials who have responsibility for this or that aspect of our lives more or less know what they're doing and are doing a decent job. Because otherwise, what's the alternative to that? The alternative to that is pretty terrifying, that I can't trust anyone and nobody knows what the heck is going on. And if you don't have faith in something transcendent, then the highest authority is going to be some form of human authority for you. The highest entity or institution or individual that I trust is going to be probably whoever society puts forward as the ruling or the governing class. Whereas if I have faith in a transcendent God, or if I have faith in a transcendent moral order that goes beyond my particular society or my particular culture or my particular moment in history, that allows me to challenge any one or another human authority as having something above them that they need to, in a sense, respond to or be responsive to. That allows me to understand that there can be such a thing, for example, as an unjust law. Martin Luther King Jr., letter from a Birmingham jail, articulates the idea of civil disobedience, that there are some cases in which citizens are, without advocating for just complete anarchy, he said there's some situations in which citizens are morally permitted and may even be morally compelled to disobey a law that has been enacted by a governing authority. And so then the question is, well, what's the criteria for doing that? How do I know if a particular law is just or unjust? The legal ideology of legal positivism just says, well, the law is whatever the ruling authority says it is, and you can't really challenge it. The law is just the law because it's declared, and there's no higher authority that it answers to. But an older tradition of classical philosophy that Martin Luther King draws on, in that he draws on the ideas, for example, of St. Augustine, and he draws on the ideas of Thomas Aquinas to say, no, there is a higher law, there is a higher authority that human law has to be responsive to. There is an idea of justice that is knowable, that is inscribed on the human heart. This comes from the natural law tradition and philosophy, that human laws are either in accord with or they're in violation of. And if they're in violation of law, of the natural law or the higher moral law, then they're not legitimate. A law that is not in accord with the natural law is no law at all, would be the formulation from Thomas Aquinas. And that is the basis for being able to challenge what otherwise we would probably take to be the highest authority, which is, whatever the government enacts and is going to punish me if I don't follow. That's sort of the be-all and end-all of what's right and good and okay and just. And this older classical tradition of philosophy says, well, yeah, much of the time that's true. You should generally obey traffic laws and criminal laws and so on and so forth. But there are situations in which a law that is passed by a duly elected legislative body may be something that you're actually permitted or maybe even required in some circumstances to disobey. So all that is to say that if you have faith in something that transcends your particular historical moment, for most people that's going to be God, right? But it could be a Platonic idea of justice. I mean, there were ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle who came to many of these same conclusions without faith in divine revelation or a faith that would be analogous to Judaism or Christianity or Islam. But for most people, that's going to be faith in a transcendent God that allows them to question and to hold up an ideal that is higher even than my own life or my own physical well-being, something that I would be willing to even die for. The highest form of witness to something like that, to a higher truth that should not be violated, are people who are willing to give their lives for that. People who are martyrs for the sake of the truth. Dissidents like Alexander Solzhenitsyn. We could see examples from history of others who said, no, rather than violate my conscience, rather than violate what I hold to be true, or what I know to be true, rather than lie publicly or take an oath that I don't actually believe in, I'm willing to sacrifice everything, including and up to my life. If viewers have seen the film A Hidden Life, which came out a few years ago, it's about an Austrian young man named Franz Jagerstatter. And Franz Jagerstatter, after Germany's sort of takeover during World War II, like all young men in Austria, he was conscripted into the German army. And he was actually willing to fight for the German army, but what he was unwilling to do was to take an oath of fidelity to Adolf Hitler, which all the members of the army were required to do. And he said, no, I'm not going to take that oath because I don't believe it, and because I don't want to pledge fidelity to that man or to his ideology. And as the film depicts, he's met with increasing pressure, including pressure from the people around him. His wife supported him. He had 2 young daughters. But the local mayor, his friends, even some of the local religious leaders were telling him, look, you could believe whatever you want, but just sign the oath. Just do this to save your own skin, because you got to take care of your family. You have your whole life ahead of you. And the other thing that they told him was, if you dissent and if you're imprisoned or worse for refusing to sign this oath to Adolf Hitler, nobody's going to know about it because you're a nobody. You're an ordinary farmer. You're going to be forgotten by history. Nobody's going to care. It's not going to have any effect on the dynamics of world history or on this war or on anything else. It will just be a useless gesture that will not make any difference. There's a scene, very powerful scene in the film, where he's in prison and he's being basically beaten by one of the prison guards. And, he's kind of crumpled down on the floor after being just bludgeoned and beaten. His face is bloodied, his eye is swollen, and he's looking up at his tormentor. And the prison guard says, if you just sign this piece of paper, then you can be free. And my favorite line in the whole film is when Franz looks up at his tormentor in prison, being beaten, senseless, and says, but I'm already free. I'm already free because you cannot coerce me to violate my conscience. I have this interior freedom that even this totalitarian regime cannot take from me. He ends up dying. He ends up being executed by Hitler in the end. He ends up giving his life for the sake of that witness, probably thinking that his friends are right. Nobody is ever going to know about me. They're not going to make a film about me one day. And yet he was willing, for the sake of his own integrity, to stand against that regime when everyone else was going along with the flow.
Well, and these are the people that we, I think, when we're in a sane state as a society, we valorize.
Yeah,
correct.
That's right. That's right. People today can look back and recognize that that was heroic, but the dissidents of their own day that are standing against an increasingly authoritarian regime, they very often don't recognize, or they vilify. It's very ironic.
It's interesting that you mention oaths. You just have to pledge this oath, and I've seen a lot of. I've seen it discussed that a lot of, for example, what you need to do to get into a particular university, for example, or get a particular job, for example, involves some kind of almost like a cookie cutter boilerplate statement that in effect functions as a loyalty oath. I'm curious if you've thought about that.
Yeah, I think this is really important because it can be an apparently on the surface strong argument that in these kinds of circumstances, it doesn't matter what you say. You can believe whatever you want interiorly. This is just an exterior formality that doesn't really matter. And the problem with that argument is going back to where we started. If totalitarian regimes are basically grounded in a lie and then basically defended by prohibiting anyone from questioning that lie. So people have to live in a kind of unreality that everyone knows is unreal, everyone knows is not true, everyone knows is not just or good, but nobody can say it. That's precisely what sustains that harmful, oppressive regime, is the willingness to go along with the lie. Solzhenitsyn, who I mentioned earlier, the great Soviet dissident, has a short essay for those who don't want to wade through the 1,000 pages of the Gulag Archipelago. He has a short essay called, I believe it's called Live Not by Lies. Rod Dreher wrote a book of the same title a few years ago, where basically Solzhenitsyn says, what can ordinary people do in a situation like Soviet communism? You may not be able to vocally protest and resist the regime, but at the very least, what you can do is refuse to publicly lie, right? It doesn't mean you have to always tell the truth. Like, there is prudence and there is, trying to navigate, and there's a duty to try to not throw your life away arbitrarily when it's not going to do any good. But where you have to draw the line is no one can force you to publicly say something that you don't actually believe. Václav Havel, the great Czech dissident who later became president of the Czech Republic after the fall of communism, wrote another very powerful essay called The Power of the Powerless. And he talks about, in this essay, he talks about an ordinary person, a grocer who runs his little corner store selling his food and selling his goods. And at one point, even though he's not necessarily forced to, there is social pressure kind of in the climate around him to go along with the regime and to fly the flag. I guess the analogy today would be, everyone during the month of June has to put up the rainbow flag as part of, their endorsement of the LGBT ideology. And a lot of corporations, a lot of individuals will sort of go along with this, whether they actually fully endorse this particular movement or this particular ideology or not. But in his day, it was communist ideology. So this grocer puts up a little sign that says, "Workers of the world unite," which may sound innocuous, but it was a Marxist slogan, right, from the Communist Manifesto. And then Havel goes through in the course of the essay describing the effect that little act of kind of complicity or compliance from a grocer who didn't actually believe that slogan at all, or the ideology behind it, the effect that that has on his soul and the effect that that has on the wider society when basically everyone starts behaving in that way. And so I think the reason it's important not to lie publicly, to live not by lies, maybe it doesn't mean speaking the truth in all circumstances all of the time, or saying every single thought that pops into your head in every, public or social circumstance, but at the very least it means not saying something that you know to be false. Is that a society that becomes characterized by that is a society where, again, people end up in that interior prison that I described earlier, that the interior prison that Franz Jagerstatter saved himself from, right? He's there in prison. All of his external freedoms have been taken from him. Even his freedom to exist in his body without being subjected to pain has been taken from him. He's being tortured, right? But he maintains that interior freedom, and he's able to look up at the prison guard and say, I don't need to sign anything. I don't need to tell a lie publicly. I don't need to make this oath because I'm already free.